Welcome back to Partnerships Unraveled, the podcast where we unravel the mysteries about partnerships and channel on a weekly basis. My name is Alex Whitford. I am the VP of Revenue here at Chanext, and this week I'm very excited to welcome our special guest, Greg. How are you doing?
I'm well, Alex. Good to speak to you today.
Yeah, I'm excited for this one. We've recently had a couple of guests on from AWS, and I think AWS is building the channel in a very different way, a very non-typical way. But maybe for the uninitiated, Greg, you can walk us through who you are, where have you been, and why they should be listening to you today.
Sure. So I'm a channel man. I've spent about 25 years in various roles in channel and partnerships. I started my career in the wonderful world of distribution. I then spent a decade or so in cybersecurity, and more recently have been sort of in charge of strategy of scaling businesses in small businesses and in large businesses. I was recently head of partner strategy into the SMB segment at AWS, and that was a global role and a lot of fun. That's me.
Yeah, we had a call 9 weeks ago, where we're sort of getting to know each other and getting to know your job. And I do remember turning around saying, Greg, you have an awesome job because you're working at a place that builds channels, but is doing it differently. We certainly at Chanext think the SMB is the most interesting part of the market because I think it's growing in opportunity and value, but it's highly complicated to get right. And for problem solvers, that to me is a really compelling challenge to sort of get your teeth into.
Yeah. It is, absolutely. And I remember that conversation. You were right. My role at AWS was a lot of fun. And, now I'm sort of out there on my own and thinking about how I can help companies, establish an AWS practice more as a consultant. I'm very excited about doing that. And and I think the conversation that we had about the different aspects of what's going on in the channel, especially when it comes to the cloud, it's a really interesting time at the moment.
Well, in your role as a consultant, but also in your role within AWS, I'm sure one of the things that you're going to be evangelizing or continue to evangelize is customer obsession. It's a core part of how Amazon as a total practice, but also how AWS has built a tremendous amount of growth and value within the market. Now, what I find really interesting about building a customer-centric channel is it's actually counterintuitive, right? Most channel leaders spend all their time thinking about the partner or themselves. How do we build a great program? And AWS has flipped that on its head. Talk to me about why customer centricity or customer obsession is so critical when we're talking about building a channel.
It's a great question. And so Amazon's leadership principle of customer obsession, it emphasizes starting with the customer and working backwards to meet their needs. So I think this is probably optimal today for a few reasons. I think if you focus on the customer, then you get this sort of profound understanding of their needs, of their preferences, of their pain points. And this really allows that creation of products and services that really resonate with customers. And I think it can be really helpful building sort of trust and loyalty with a customer. When a customer feels that a company is genuinely invested in their success, it obviously is a real driver for trust and loyalty. And we're all after sort of long-term relationships with customers and repeat business. So I think, it's especially important when driving with sort of a repeat business. The other thing that I think about is how customer-centric businesses are really the high innovators in the market. So a customer-centric approach it drives that continuous feedback loop, and these companies that sort of adapt and improve the offerings based upon real world usage and the advantage that comes with that, these are the ones that are winning, I think, Alex. So I'd say companies that are doing this are getting sustainable growth, and they're sort of evolving with the needs of customers, and they're retaining customers, they're winning new ones, perhaps even through sort of positive word of mouth.
So I had a really interesting conversation with Harold, who's at Trend Micro. A podcast was released a couple of months ago. He's ex-AWS, and he was talking about how, for example, deal protection for the renewal, they've scrapped from their program because it actually protects the partner and not the customer. And actually the customer may want to, make a different decision, and building around the customer centric, and he's trying to drive customer centricity into their program and into their design, which I fully understand from a sort of macro business perspective. If you win the customers, ultimately everything will pull back and flow from there, right? So if we provide maximal value, you're ultimately going to win. But that's not what the partner wants. And suddenly you've got to balance customer centricity with partner centricity. And I imagine there are certainly instances where those two sort of butt heads. How do you sort of think about balancing that when you're trying to scale a channel?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love what Trend is doing. So, I think you have to follow some steps here. That's certainly what AWS is doing. And it starts with probably aligning goals between yourself, the vendor, and the partner. You've got to ensure that both customer and partner goals, you have that alignment, you have that shared vision. Partners really understand the importance of CSAT, of customer satisfaction, and they're incentivized to prioritize that, right? Another thing that I think is super important is maintaining a sort of open and transparent communication with both customers and partners. And so, regular updates, those sort of feedback loops, and that co-sell motions, and even sort of collaborative planning sessions, you want to ensure that everybody's on the same page, right? And then when it comes to those joint customer engagements, involve the partner in that customer engagement as early as you can in those joint marketing campaigns, those events, co-host those events, and build sort of collaborative, customer support initiatives that makes partners feel valued and integral to the customer experience and to what the vendors do. The last thing I'd say is just a couple of words on training and support. It's a top three of what most partners ask for when it comes to dealing with vendors. But if you can include, that customer focus, that customer obsession in the product training, schedule things like customer workshops and give access to the customer feedback, both good and bad, through to the partner, then that's going to be so much more effective when they're out there talking to customers. And so actually circling back on making sure that you're aligned. It's so important, I think, to have shared metrics and shared KPIs so that both the CSAT and the partner performance, they're aligned towards each other, and recognize and reward those partners with incentives that are sort of running in that direction. AWS has a lot of competencies and strong programs around recognizing and rewarding partners that put the effort into scaling up their skill sets and focusing on certain areas. And that can sort of maintain really high standards that obviously we're all looking to drive.
That, I think that's fundamental, right? So maybe framing it as customer centricity versus partner centricity isn't the right methodology. The overarching principle is let's build the most value for the customer. Right. And in doing that, we need to drive that philosophy into the partners. And I love your point about common language. I'm aware that, for example, AWS works through a MEDDIC or a MEDPIC infrastructure with both ISVs and partners so that everyone's speaking in common language. Why? Because then we know that we're not misaligned on how information flows. And I think that's it feels like such a small detail, but you can understand at scale, especially in the SMB, having everyone talk the same economic buyer, infosec procedure. It's like, oh, we understand what we're doing. What metrics are we going to drive into this deal? How are we measuring for success? Having that common process, that common drive That's how you get partner centricity falling in line with customer centricity and both things playing well together.
Right. I mean, I can remember it was a while back now, probably 18 months, 2 years ago. One of my senior leaders at AWS was asking questions about how the partner community as a whole can be as customer obsessed as AWS is, and he was asking real questions about how can we build mechanisms to ensure that is the case today and is the case going forward, and that really changed a lot about how partnerships and the APO, the partner ecosystem at AWS, was used in co-sell motions, because once those senior execs started driving that customer-centric through partner ecosystem, then obviously customers benefit a lot.
There is a phrase that we use a lot internally at Chanex within our leadership team, and we say there's a difference between thought leadership and thought doing, right? And what you've just called out there is like, we can be a thought leader about customer centricity, or we can actually drive the change in the market that the market requires, right? And I always think evangelizing things sort of utterly pointless unless you're actually going to do the thing and actually really enforce and make the change, which sort of segues me onto my next question. AWS is, as most large enterprise organizations, quite complicated from an organizational structure. You're campaigning in your role about SMB and strategy and partnerships, but you're then working into the regions who then have autonomous decision making. So how are you going about winning the sort of hearts and minds of the direct organization, or the people who aren't so channel orientated or maybe don't know much about the channel? How do you go about winning the hearts and minds in all those different regions?
Yeah, I think for anyone in a role where you're working inside an organization that doesn't get it yet, just get the value of partners, it can be quite a challenge. And especially at multinational companies like AWS, but who run their business as close to the customer as possible. So a lot of decision making at Amazon is done as a local level. There's no sort of central or top down push. So yeah, I had to go and convince dozens of people that the partner strategies that we were offering were right for the customer in their local territory. So it really sort of emphasized probably one of the most important leadership principles at Amazon, which was earn trust. So, and earning trust is based upon things like honesty and transparent communication, of course. But what made Amazon probably a little bit different is how all the leaders were driving a culture of active listening. Yeah. So this is where they're really encouraged to listen attentively to folks. This is all folks. Hear concerns but ideas and feedback. Obviously, the most important voice is the customer here, and where a customer is sort of saying, we've enjoyed working with X, Y, and Z, their local partner, be it MSP or SI or whatever, then leaders are sort of encouraged to listen to that and sort of say, okay, well, we can help make that work. And the other thing that I think I really saw in my time at AWS is that the culture is very vocally self-critical. Again, folks are encouraged to sort of acknowledge their own mistakes, look for areas of improvement. It's a real sort of humility that can be very inspiring and offer that sort of culture of continuous improvement and collaboration. That's where I was emphasizing on. I didn't really have, there wasn't really a time where I thought, okay, I can't point out an area that wasn't working so well. I was encouraged to do so, and leaders were saying to me, what can we do better? And I'd say, well, here's some data that sort of points to the fact that this customer experience wasn't optimal, but partners can help, and here's how. So I think those sort of three things really helped drive a lot of new things that we did over the last couple of years, and build more and more traction and more sort of emphasis on this partner-centric approach, married to and with the customer-centric.
And to me, I'm people in the office are going to start laughing, right? There's a few businesses that I call out that just, you can see they play the game a different way, and it's unsurprising when you start to see the results, right? But that self analysis, right, I think is so important. We really try here at Chanex to talk about development as a proactive procedure, and that only comes from a fundamental understanding of what are we doing well, and really more importantly, what are we doing poorly, and how can we start to build plans and start to execute so that we can improve, and that improvement starts with yourself, and then comes out into the business. One of the things that I found so interesting being a leader is putting people in the right position so that they can be successful, right? Because you can only change people so much. Now, one of the things that can happen, I'll hold my hand up here, is as a salesperson, intrinsically or by profile, most salespeople find operations and the requirement to do an operational heavy lift a burden, right? Hygiene in a CRM is famously worse done by salespeople than almost any other part of the organization. We spoke previously that actually there is quite a significant operational burden on some of the partner managers, which by profile, partner managers typically salespeople, networking people, relationship people, right? They want to be focused here, but they're also having a burden. How do you see that impacting their ability to be successful?
I see it having a big impact. And, it's one that perhaps isn't acknowledged as widely as it should be. I've, as I said earlier, 25 years, either being a partner manager or managing partner management teams. And it's always been a struggle stripping out as much of the operational burden from the partner managers as I could. But today, I see that it's a fairly wide range, but even at the lowest point, I see about 30% being best case for a partner manager spending a third of their time on operational duties. And I've seen it as high as 70%, right? So more than 2/3 of their time on operational duties. And you've got to think about the fact that obviously these people are business people, right? They're usually very seasoned, senior people who know how to drive business and relationships, and to have them doing that sort of percentage of time on operations and administration is a waste. And I imagine that if you could increase that by at least 30%, if not 70%, what sort of numbers would they be pulling in? So I think it's a really significant impact. But there is solutions, I think, around the corner. I think the impact of Gen AI and AI here will be prolific and profound, and so much of what that operational burden is doing for partners can be taken away, and they can be much more sort of in the trenches with the partners and closing customer deals than they've ever been before. So I expect in the next 12 to 18 months we'll see a plethora of both, I guess, startup companies, but also established companies offering these tools to reduce, friction in the channel, and perhaps folks like AWS will develop their own. But I can really see that sort of being reduced in the very, very short term, in the next 12, 18, maximum 24 months, and that's exciting because I think then these partner managers will be much more, true partners to the accounts that they look after, and really, like I said, driving strong co-sales, shoulder to shoulder, in it together with the partner, talking to customers about solutions.
I think that's really exciting because my belief on AI is that people struggle as humans do. If I ask you to think of a million people, you can't put that in your brain. Our brains just don't work that way. I think people struggle to understand how significant the change of AI is going to be. But I did read an amazing article about what the shift of AI is going to be over the next 24 months. Right now, people look at AI as a creative tool. But hopefully for humanity, the idea behind AI isn't that AI does all the creative work and we do all the operational work. We want to see that flip on its head. So we want to spend all our life, writing films and writing lovely books and writing poetry so that AI can do all of the grunt work, right? So it's great to hear that operational burden is going to flip, and AI is going to be able to help do some of these swivel chair processes, these manual processes, because my view on where the channel is going to go is we can hire super specialists in the exact area that AI can't do, and that's person-to-person relationships, right? Yeah. That's really where we need to focus, and if we can remove that 30 to 70% burden, that's going to help drive one huge success, but I think it's also going to drive real happiness and adoption of those roles because people are doing the bit that they are born to do.
Right. Well, yeah, exactly. We'll get this huge boost in morale, in retention, I guess probably in acquisition, because partner managers will suddenly feel like a really strong career path, even for direct salespeople today. So I see a lot of like starting partner management and they want to move into direct sales. I don't see that being the case going forward. I think there will be even some movement from direct sales into the partner world, and that's very exciting because we're all up leveling here and we're all becoming more talented business people.
I'm hoping you're not going to disagree with my next point because I'm going to quote you to you. But at the recent AWS summit, you mentioned that SMBs contact their IT providers about 70% of the way through their buying journey. Right. SMBs do a lot of research on their own and usually develop a preference towards a particular brand or technology, whether that decision's a good one, a bad one, or a terrible one. Why is it so important that SMBs focus on trying to be involved earlier in the buying process, or why should partners want to get ahead of that 70% of the research journey?
Yeah, this is so important. It was really enlightening for me. It was a survey that AWS ran and that we shared with partners across all of the summits. And 70% of the buying process is actually step 11 of 12. So, those first 11 steps are what we all know a customer does do. It does its own research, and it does it across a lot of different mediums obviously through referrals and word of mouth, but also through papers and vendor websites and reviews and things like that. So, why is it important? Well, I think, partners should have the greatest possible role in the customer decision making process, and we're all looking for that sort of trusted advisor status with the customer. And, the reason why I talked about this in my role with SMB is because the trusted advisor status is particularly important to SMB customers. They lack that sort of technical depth that an enterprise has. We know that only about 1 in 10 SMB customers have dedicated IT resource. So I think 7% have developers, 2% have security expertise. So they need help, is the point. And so trusted advisor status is where you're really going to sort of drive that long-term relationship that I referred to earlier. And so earlier on in the process is so much more important because it's going to help that customer be more informed. There's going to be a closer relationship between partner and customer, and ultimately, you're going to be in it together. And I see some really interesting, especially in the world of managed services, some really interesting business models coming out about shared impact, shared values, the value creation from technology. And I think if you're involved in that decision-making process right at the start, then you've got a much better chance of designing the right solution for the customer that drives the maximum value.
We just released earlier, I think last week, depending on when this was released, so late August, we released the president of Acronis came on, and he spoke a lot about how you capture and inform the SMB. And because he works in security, it is a lot of information. And so we need MSPs to be able to inform so that they can provide not just the right product, but the right service wraparound. And to me, that's why it's so critical, because if you're not dealing with IT teams in the enterprise who can, have their own accreditations and opinions on how they're going to weave everything together, in the SMB, why it's so critical is because when something goes wrong, I need to be able to talk to someone. Right. I need to be able to, and the vendor typically isn't going to answer your call, right? There needs to be a partner in the way that's going to help knit everything together. And why for me, partners need to get involved much earlier is because two brands might broadly do the same thing, but one of those brands might integrate into the other 4 or 5 services that you provide, that you've got to manage service wraparound, so that if one leg of the table falls down, you know how to fix it. Right. And to me, that sort of business continuity motion, especially in that sort of cybersec world, that's so critical. And where I see MSPs focusing a lot right now is having that layer of protection wrapped around those SMBs so businesses can drive forward. But that integration story, I think that ecosystem story, that's why 70% or step 11 of 12 is far too late, because we need to know that integration is going to work. Not just it's technically it works, but that we've got the service wrap, that we've got the engineers, that we've got the supporting infrastructure to really make that a success.
Yeah, I hear you. One of the things that I think is going to be really critical for customers going forward is bringing together what's often referred to as the power of 3, which is, typically the hyperscaler and the infrastructure, and then is an ISV solution of some description, and then of course finally that third party is the partner who's managing the deployment into the customer's environment, and bringing together the power of these 3 in the most efficient way possible through things like marketplaces, which is particularly efficient when you come to the end point of that buying cycle, when it's all about procuring it and managing it. That is very effective, and that's why we're seeing so much growth in all of hyperscaler marketplaces. But I think there's still some work to do in bringing together these solutions, making sure, to your point, Alex, that things are optimal, working together, and we're sort of maximizing the value behind each service or product. And that each party is really effective in working together and presenting something simple, particularly for an SMB, for folks to understand. In my role, I try to speak to as many SMB customers as I possibly can, and what was pretty consistent, across the world, really, from SMB, was the concern about overstretching themselves, of leaving a set of EC2 instances on and getting a huge bill at the end of the month and things like that, because they just couldn't afford to do things like that. So, having guardrails, I call guardrails, so that customers understand exactly what they're buying, what it's going to cost them, providing some sort of ceiling so that they know that they're not going to overspend, understanding clearly what value this is driving for their organization, be it improvements to the top line or operational cost saving improvements. It will be one or the other, and that way that we're going to be so much more effective in explaining technology to folks, as I said, 90% of which don't have dedicated IT resources.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. That sort of understanding, because I'd never thought about it from the SMB perspective, but you're right. You'd hate to suddenly get a 30 grand bill at the end of the month because you forgot to turn a feature off and suddenly consumption's gone through the roof, right? So putting that protection in, again, reinforces that trusted advisor. There's a difference between sort of handling objections and handling objectives, right? And so if a partner can come in before the end customer has even thought about that problem and say, hey, by the way, we see this, this, and this, so we like to put these guardrails around to protect you. Think of the level of confidence and trust that builds, and focusing back on customer obsession. That's ultimately what's going to provide maximal value.
Yep.
But we are not talking about all the hyperscalers. We are focusing on one hyperscaler in particular. You're now focusing on companies that need help understanding how to partner more effectively with AWS. How's that been going?
It's a little overwhelming, actually. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but what I mean by that is there seems to be a plethora of companies out there that want to understand how to work with AWS, how to drive co-sell, how to build relationships, how to understand marketplace, and things like that. So I'm getting a lot of folks sort of reaching out, which is great, and I'm happy to help and really happy to share and have conversations. But I think there does need to be a more scalable way of doing this, and so what I'm trying to look at with my company is how do I get what's up here and what's the best practices that I see and that AWS sees and put it into some sort of scalable mechanism so that everybody can benefit for it. So I referred to earlier about things that I think are going to happen over the next 12 to 18 months with Gen AI and AI, and so I think this will also apply here. I mean, I'm excited about being involved in that in some way. But for now, it's going great, and I'm loving seeing the impact that it's having and sharing, some of these best practices. So couldn't be happier.
Good. So Greg.ai coming soon is what we're saying.
Something like that.
So it sounds like you're filling up your pipeline of potential customers through word of mouth and referrals, which I think is a fitting place to end, because that's really what powers the channel, but it also is what powers our podcast. Greg, we'd like to ask our current guest who they think we should have on next. Who did you have in mind?
I had in mind my good friend, Jason Ellis, who is, as hopefully many of you know, the VP of Channel at Sophos. Jason and I met many, many years ago, embarrassing a number of years ago. He's a great guy, but one of the most passionate partnerships and channel people. So I nominate you, Jason. So,
excellent. Well, Jason, I'm hunting you down very shortly with Greg's help. And Greg, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming on and sharing your knowledge.
It's been great, Alex. Great to talk to you. Really enjoyable. And thanks very much for the invitation.
Awesome. We'll see our listeners next week.